On the morning of January 18, 1994, a Tibetan county official named Sonam Dargye stood alone in a wilderness at 4,600 meters above sea level, in temperatures that had dropped to somewhere near -40, facing 18 armed men across the frozen ground of Hojil. He had a pistol. They had rifles. Between them, loaded into 7 vehicles, were 1,800 hides, wild yak and Tibetan antelope, stripped from animals killed in the weeks before. Sonam Dargye was 32 years old. He had no radio contact with anyone who could reach him in time. What happened next is the reason that the wild yak exists in the numbers it does today, and almost nobody outside of Tibet has ever heard his name. This is the story of the largest land animal on the Tibetan Plateau, an animal that explorers in the 19th century described in terms that are almost impossible to picture now. Hills and plains, in the words of the Russian naturalist Nikolai Przewalski, traveling the plateau in 1876, that were literally black with yak. Thousands of them, visible at once, moving across the high steppe like a slow, dark tide. By the time the first scientist ever tried to count them properly, a century later, the tide had almost gone out entirely. What was left was a scattered remnant population clinging to the most remote and inhospitable corners of the highest plateau on Earth. And a small group of Tibetan herders who decided, with no funding, no authority, and no real plan, that the tide was not going to go out on their watch. I want to start with the animal itself, because the wild yak is genuinely unlike anything most people in the West have ever encountered, or even thought about. The animal you see on restaurant menus and in outdoor clothing brands, yak butter, yak wool, yak cheese, that is the domestic yak, Bos grunions, one of the most useful domesticated animals on Earth, numbering around 14 million and found across a vast swath of Central Asia. The wild yak, Bos mutus, the name means mute ox because unlike its domestic cousin, it is nearly silent, is something else. A mature bull can stand 2 meters at the shoulder and weigh close to 1,000 kilograms. Its lungs are 3 times the volume of a comparable domestic cow's, an adaptation to air so thin that a person walking at the same elevation struggles to carry on a conversation without stopping to breathe. Its skin carries a dense undercoat of fine fiber, so insulating that the animal can sleep on frozen ground at -30 without apparent discomfort. It evolved on the Tibetan Plateau specifically over millions of years to live at altitudes where almost nothing else of its size can function at all. The roof of the world, as the plateau is sometimes called, is not a hospitable place for large mammals. The wild yak didn't just survive it, it was built by it. And for most of recorded history, it was everywhere up there. The plateau, which covers roughly 2.5 million square kilometers across what is now Tibet, Qinghai, Xinjiang, and parts of neighboring countries, is the largest and highest plateau on Earth. Przewalski was not exaggerating when he wrote about the thousands. Early 20th century travelers in the region described herds of 200 and 300 animals moving together across the alpine steppe. Bulls the size of small automobiles, their long, dark coats sweeping the ground as they walked. The wild yak shaped the plateau it lived on. Its grazing kept the grasses short and diverse. Its dung, deposited across thousands of square kilometers of high-altitude meadow each year, returned nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium to soils that would otherwise lock their nutrients away in the permafrost beneath them. Research published in peer-reviewed journals on the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau has since confirmed that yak gut passage carries viable seeds from dozens of native plant species, scarifying hard seed coats and distributing them across the landscape in dung that decomposes slowly through the short alpine summer. The wild yak was not merely living in the plateau's ecosystem, it was maintaining it, the way that a river maintains a valley, by running through it. What happened over the course of the 20th century is a story that played out in slow motion, without headlines, in one of the most inaccessible places on Earth. Hunting pressure had been building since the 19th century as outsiders, and later, modernizing local populations with access to firearms, moved into the plateau. By the 1950s and 1960s, as pastoralists with domestic livestock began moving into the northern Changtang, the vast high-altitude steppe that had historically been the wild yak's core range, The competition for grazing land began pushing wild herds toward the fringes of even their most remote strongholds. By the 1980s, something more acute was happening. A global luxury market had discovered the extraordinarily fine undercoat fiber of the Tibetan antelope, the chiru, which shares the high steppe with the wild yak. A single chatouche shawl, woven from the scraped hides of 3 to 5 chiru, was selling for $30,000 to $50,000 in European and American markets. Poaching gangs, armed, mobile, and operating in a legal vacuum, moved into Hoshil in the western part of Qinghai province. The chiru was the primary target, but wild yak hides were valuable too, and the bulls, slow, fearless, accustomed to having no predators large enough to trouble them, were easy to find and easy to kill. By the time Dr. George Schaller of the Wildlife Conservation Society began the first systematic scientific survey of wild yaks ever conducted, working from 1984 to 1994 across the Plateau, in collaboration with the Tibet Forestry Bureau, the picture that emerged was sobering. Wildlife surveys on the plateau over that decade revealed that yaks had persisted in several small populations, and in one large tract of alpine steppe in the northern Tibet Autonomous Region, in an area of roughly 400,000 square kilometers. The Changtang Reserve alone, at 284,000 square kilometers, an area larger than the United Kingdom, contained an estimated 7,000 to 7,500 animals, about half the global population. The total number of wild yaks remaining on Earth, Schaller concluded, was probably no more than 15,000. The worldwide population had declined by more than 30% in 3 decades. And in the areas where the poaching pressure was heaviest, the collapse was not gradual. In some parts of Hoshil, entire subpopulations had simply disappeared. Recoveries like this one are unfolding across the Tibetan Plateau right now, in landscapes so remote that most of them will never be documented. This is where Sonam Dargye enters the story. And I want to be careful here about how I tell this part, because it is easy to tell it in a way that makes it feel distant or political or symbolic. It is none of those things. It is a story about a specific man in a specific place who made a specific decision, because he grew up watching something he loved disappear and could not find a reason to keep standing still. Sonam Dargye was born in 1962 in Sokya Township in what is now Yushu Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture, Qinghai Province. He grew up in a herding family on the same high grasslands where his grandparents had grazed livestock alongside the wild herds. The plateau was not wilderness to him, not in the way a visitor might experience it. It was home. The wild yaks and the Tibetan antelopes that moved across it were part of what home meant. By the late 1980s, he was working as a county official, deputy secretary of the Jidoi County Party Committee, and he was watching armed poaching gangs operate openly in Hoshil within a legal framework that had not yet developed the enforcement tools to stop them. China had enacted its wildlife protection law in 1988, classifying the wild yak as a Class 1 protected species, the highest designation available. The law existed on paper. In Hoshil, in practice, it was not being enforced at the scale required. In 1992, Sonam Dargye did something that had no precedent in China. He organized a team, a small group of Tibetan herders and local volunteers, into what they called the Wild Yak Brigade. There was no official budget line for this, no dedicated government vehicles, no satellite phones, no drones. The team had a single pistol between them. They drove out into a 45,000 square kilometer wilderness at an average elevation of 4,600 meters, in borrowed vehicles, in temperatures that routinely fell below -30 in winter. And they started intercepting poachers. They caught gangs red-handed. They confiscated vehicles and weapons and hides. They made arrests that had no real legal infrastructure to process. And they kept going back. What comes next is why this story matters beyond one man and one brigade. On January 18, 1994, Sonam Dargye and his team stopped a convoy of poachers near Taiyang Lake in the heart of Hoshil. 18 men, 7 vehicles, 1,800 hides. In the confrontation that followed, Sonam Dargye was shot and killed. Rescuers who reached the site found his body frozen in a kneeling position, his rifle still raised, as if the cold had preserved the last thing he had been doing. He was 32 years old. His brother-in-law, Jaba Dorje, took over leadership of the Wild Yak Brigade. The patrols continued. Jaba Dorje was later killed at his home by a bullet fired through a window. The brigade continued still. The two men's deaths were not the end of the story they had started. They were, in the difficult way that these things sometimes work, the beginning of its larger chapter. The killing of Sonam Dargye triggered a nationwide response in China that the quiet patrols alone had not been able to generate. The poaching of Plateau wildlife became a national issue. In 1996, the Chinese government honored Sonam Dargye as a National Environmental Protection Martyr. A protection station in Hoshil was named for him, and in 1997, 3 years after his death, in the year his daughter turned 4, the State Council of China formally established the Hoshil National Nature Reserve, 45,000 square kilometers of protected high-altitude wilderness, with a legal mandate, a funded ranger force, and the authority to do what Sonam Dargye's brigade had been doing with a single pistol and no salary for 5 years. The protection the reserve gave the landscape was not immediate. Anti-poaching work in terrain that vast, at elevations that extreme, takes years to establish. But it was cumulative. Year by year, the presence of the ranger force made the cost of operating in Hoshil too high for the poaching gangs. The last confirmed incident of illegal hunting gunfire in Hoshil was recorded in 2009. That was 15 years ago. In a place that had been an active killing ground through most of the 1980s and 1990s, the silence that followed is itself a kind of measurement. In 2003, Dr. George Schaller returned to the Changtang region, a part of the reserve he had surveyed twice in the early 1990s, at the height of the poaching crisis. He found that all wildlife species in the area had increased. Most significantly, in one specific survey zone where the wild yak count had recorded just 13 individuals during the worst years of the pressure, the population had grown to over 187. He wrote to the World Wildlife Fund afterward, in terms that are as close as a scientist of his restraint ever comes to relief. The Tibet Forestry Department has obviously made a dedicated and successful effort in protecting the wildlife. The picture is not complete yet. The wild yak's recovery is real and documented, but it is not finished, and the honest version of this story requires saying that clearly. The Chinese Academy of Forestry's most recent assessment puts the current wild yak population in China at approximately 22,000 animals, an increase from the 15,000 estimated in 1995, but a modest one for a period of nearly 30 years. For comparison, the Tibetan antelope, the chiru, which faced a similarly catastrophic collapse in the same period, has rebounded from fewer than 20,000 in the late 1980s to more than 70,000 today, a recovery that scientists describe as dramatic. The wild yak has not moved at that pace. The reasons are several, and they are worth understanding because they define what the next chapter of this story looks like. Wild yaks reproduce slowly. A cow does not produce her first calf until she is around 4 years old, and even in good conditions produces at most 1 calf every 2 years. The animal's life history is calibrated for extreme environments, where slow and steady is what survival requires. It is not calibrated for rapid population rebound from a crash. The second problem is hybridization. Where wild yaks and domestic yak herds overlap at the edges of their ranges, wild bulls and domestic cows interbreed. The hybrid offspring are fertile. Over generations, this process blurs the genetic integrity of the wild population in ways that are difficult to reverse and harder still to detect without systematic genetic sampling. The Wildlife Conservation Society, working in collaboration with the Changtang National Nature Reserve Management Bureau and the Tibetan Academy of Agriculture and Animal Husbandry Sciences, has been developing buffer zone protocols to reduce the contact areas. But it is a long-term project in a landscape measured in hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. And climate change is reshaping the plateau at a rate that worries the scientists who study it most closely. The Tibetan plateau is warming at nearly twice the average global rate. Glaciers are receding. Permafrost is thawing. The alpine steppe that the wild yak evolved to inhabit is not a static landscape. It is changing in real time, and the direction of those changes will shape what habitat is available to the species in the decades ahead. The Ho Shil UNESCO World Heritage Inscription, granted in 2017, recognized the plateau as one of the world's great intact high-altitude ecosystems. That recognition matters, not as a declaration of victory, but as a formal acknowledgement that what is up there is worth protecting, at a scale commensurate with what it actually is. The largest, highest plateau on Earth. A place that shaped the wild yak over millions of years. A place that the wild yak, in turn, has been shaping, through its grazing, its dung, its seed dispersal, its slow movement across the steppe, for as long as the plateau has had grass on it. Step back from the numbers and the science for a moment, and look at the shape of the whole thing. A man who grew up watching the wild herds move across the plateau, grew up. He took a job. He watched the herds start to disappear. He organized a team with no budget and a single pistol, and started driving out into a wilderness the size of a small country to stop it. He was killed at 32. The thing he spent his life trying to create, a protected reserve with the legal authority to do what he had been doing by force of personal decision, came into existence 3 years after he died. 26 years after that, the last poaching gunshot in that wilderness was fired. 15 years after that last shot, 22,000 wild yaks are walking the high steppe. The Sonam Dargye protection station sits in the heart of Ho Shil, at 4,200 meters above sea level, staffed by rangers, some of whom are the children of herders who knew him. His portrait hangs in their homes. There is a word in Tibetan for the wild yak that carries within it centuries of the relationship between the people of the plateau and this animal. The name was always there, carried in the language, even in the years when the herds had thinned to the point where a person could travel for days without seeing one. The wild yak is called the docile, enduring one, slow to anger, patient beyond what seems possible. But once its home is threatened, something that does not stop. The Wild Yak Brigade chose that name deliberately. The connection between the animal and the man it is named for is not accidental. Both of them, in the end, were doing the same thing. Refusing to leave. There is something I keep coming back to in this story, and it is not the heroism, though the heroism is real. It is the scale of the consequence relative to the scale of the action. A county official, a borrowed truck, a pistol, a team of herders patrolling a wilderness in winter, and the protection of one of the last great large mammal populations on the roof of the world. We tend to think conservation requires institutions, funding, international frameworks, scientific programs. All of those things matter. All of them contributed to what Ho Shil is today. But the thing that made all of them possible, the reason there was a Ho Shil to protect, was a decision made by one specific person, in one specific place, with no resources and no guarantee of anything. Because he had grown up watching the herds and could not find a way to watch them disappear. I'd like to leave you with a question that I find genuinely worth sitting with. Think about a place you knew as a child, a piece of landscape, a field, a hillside, a stretch of water, where something was present that is absent now. An animal, a sound, a quality of wildness. And ask yourself whether you ever knew who, if anyone, stood in the way of that loss. Because most of the time, somebody tried, and most of the time, their name has been forgotten. Let me know in the comments what that place was for you and whether you ever found out. And subscribe, because the recoveries happening right now in the places nobody is watching are stranger and more important than you would expect.